My name is Claire Stevens, and I am a program officer here at PCORI and one of the PLACER points of contact. So I'm just going to spend the next few minutes talking very specifically about this PLACER funding mechanism. So PLACER was designed to support large-scale, high-impact randomized trials that have compelling comparative effectiveness questions, and these trials are expected to be complicated and at risk of achieving their research aims. And so to provide some time to address some of this risk, the risk could be around, recruitment or getting sites on board, that kind of thing, and assess whether the study is feasible. And to maximize the likelihood of success, the PLACER funding mechanism includes an 18-month feasibility phase, and you'll see that here. You can propose up to $2 million in direct costs for that 18-month feasibility phase, and then up to $20 million in direct costs for the 5-year full-scale study phase. So there are a few things you're going to hear me say many times during this presentation, and that is by design. And that's just because they're very important and very unique to PLACER. So I will try not to sound like a broken record, but if I say it multiple times, it's because we think it's important. And the first one of these is about the scale and scope of PLACER. As I said, on that first slide, these are high impact trials and really expected to have sufficient scale and scope that they require more than $12 million in direct costs to successfully complete the full scale trial. So, up to 20 million, but more than $12 million. Some other key PLACER requirements: studies applying to PLACER must propose an individual or cluster randomized controlled trial. Observational studies are not appropriate for the PLACER mechanism. And they must have an independent data coordinating center. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. PLACER also comes with some opportunities. That feasibility phase that I mentioned really does provide the time and resources for study teams and their partners to work together to strengthen engagement, to get the infrastructure in place that's really going to support both the feasibility phase and prepare for the full-scale trial should it occur. And then as Mike just talked about, studies also have access to PCORNet, the National Patient-Centered Clinical Research Network, and that can be used for, clinical research infrastructure and data resources. There are some distinctive requirements for the PLACER mechanism. I've already mentioned a few of these, but, they bear repeating. There must be a feasibility phase proposed, followed by the full-scale clinical trial. There must be an independent data coordinating center to manage the analytical, statistical, and data management of the trial. And finally, the stakeholder engagement must not only be robust, but for PLACER must include experienced leadership and stakeholder engagement as part of the overall trial leadership team in both study phases. So in terms of research requirements, applications to the PLACER PFA have to include a thorough description of the comparators, and all comparators must have established efficacy and be in current use in multiple settings. So we're looking for systematic reviews, meta-analysis, that kind of level of evidence for the comparators. The application must propose research that studies both benefits and potential harms as delivered in real-world settings. Applicants must clearly describe how patients and other stakeholders were consulted during the development of the proposal, and they have to articulate a clear ongoing engagement approach that demonstrates incorporation of the foundational expectations for partnership and research, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in this slide presentation. And then finally, applications must provide complete and replicable statistical analysis plans. So for the feasibility phase, we've talked a little bit about it. When we assess the proposed, and Merit Reviews assesses the proposed feasibility phase, there are a few things that we're looking for. Applicants need to demonstrate that how they will manage the infrastructure, and then need so establishing study sites, data systems, obtaining IRB protocol. Again, PLACER studies are going to be large and complex and typically involve quite a few sites. So the applicants must describe how they're sort of going to manage all of that and the infrastructure needed. There must be robust engagement activities, and it should be clear how those activities support the study design, support acceptability, and also analysis and dissemination. Applications to describe how they will recruit, enroll, and randomize participants in both the feasibility phase, and that should be, in the feasibility phase, it should be at a rate that justifies the assumptions in the main study. And then, of course, if anything from that will be different, describe also recruitment enrollment into the main study. And finally, the feasibility phase must include assessments of treatment acceptance and intervention fidelity, and as time permits, collect follow-up measures. So here you see a list of activities that should be included in the feasibility phase, but the list is not exhaustive. Study teams can certainly include other activities that they deem critical for this sort of startup phase. I do want to point out two important points on this slide. First, that the feasibility phase, again, like I said, must be used to test recruitment, enrollment, and randomization procedures. So that part has to happen in the feasibility phase. And second, the feasibility phase must not be used for determining efficacy or effect size. Those two must be determined and described prior in the application and prior to study launch. So as the feasibility phase is wrapping up, PCORI and an expert advisory panel will evaluate the progress made during that feasibility phase. And this assessment includes consideration of accomplishments, including the timely completion of pre-specified milestones, and as well as a consideration of the likelihood of success of the full-scale study based on all that has happened in the feasibility phase. If the study is approved to move to the full-scale trial, PCORI will modify the original contract for continued funding, and we'll negotiate the milestones for that full-scale phase at that time, too. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about the Data Coordinating Center because this is a unique requirement for the PLACER funding mechanism. PLACER requires an independent data coordinating center, or DCC, you'll hear us call it. And you may submit a letter of intent without naming the DCC, but the DCC must be named and described in the application itself. The application must also include enough information to determine if the DCC meets the necessary standards for data integrity, security, and protection. And in terms of the role, the DCC is expected to contribute to the final trial design, study documents like the protocol and the statistical analysis plan. And during the main study, the DCC should provide management of data reporting, data completeness, reporting to the DSMB, the Data Safety and Monitoring Board, and conducting the statistical analysis of the study itself. So to foster the independence of the clinical and data and statistical leadership of the study, PCORI strongly discourages the use of a combined DCC and CCC, or Clinical Coordinating Center. We really encourage those to be separate entities. And we do require the principal investigator of the DCC and the principal investigator of the CCC to serve as dual PIs for the study. Again, just to ensure that, that scientific integrity, the independence of the two arms. And if you wish to propose an alternative arrangement that's not a separate entity, you have to seek permission from PCORI prior to the submission of your application. And just to note that one of the dual PIs will be named the contact PI, and that's typically the PI at the prime award site. So, Elizabeth already gave us a lot of categories of non-responsiveness generally to PCORI research, and I just want to note a few here for PLACER in particular. If an LOI requests total direct cost less than 12 million, that will be considered non-responsive. A few other non-responsive categories: failing to propose a randomized controlled trial, failure to describe how you plan to recruit, enroll, and randomize in the feasibility phase, or proposing to use the feasibility phase to test effect size or determine efficacy of any of the interventions. Those are all non-responsive categories, and those non-responsive applications will be withdrawn from funding consideration. Just to note that, we do have other funding mechanisms, including our broad pragmatic studies. So for smaller studies that do come in below that 12 million direct cost, we really encourage applicants to look at our BPS or some of our topical funding opportunities. For those who are new to PCORI funding, we do have some unique requirements around patient care cost. We define patient care cost broadly, and those can include the cost of the intervention itself, as well as clinical personnel costs to implement those interventions. Applicants who are requesting patient care cost must demonstrate that there's a critical and unmet need meriting study, that the costs present an impediment to study participation, and that the intervention will be sustainable past the research funding period, should PCORI choose to support it. And just to note that PCORI coverage of patient care costs is not guaranteed, so applicants are encouraged to seek funding or co-funding for patient care costs from other sources. PCORI has some requirements around cost data that are perhaps a little bit unique from some other funders. So while collection of data on cost burdens or economic impacts relevant to patients or stakeholders is allowed, a formal cost effectiveness analysis or direct comparison of costs between two alternative approaches, cost simulation and economic impacts as the primary outcome of the study, none of those are allowed. And again, such applications that propose those as primary outcomes would be considered non-responsive.